It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I am your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. I'm really excited about our guest today. He seems to be really tuned into all the same kind of topics that we cover here week after week after week. He's a film producer, an author, award-winning professional journalist, investigative journalist, Tim Tate. And his movie production company is called Interesting Films. And they all do, they're interesting to me. That's for sure. I can tell you that. Hey, Tim, are you there?
I am indeed. Hello.
Hey, so, Tim, tell us about yourself. I know you've had a very honored career.
I don't know about honored. I've been doing it a long time. I've been a working journalist, investigative journalist for the best part of 40 years now, and I've been making investigative documentaries, by and large, for British television and other networks, international networks, for much of that time, and writing a lot of books, mostly investigative as well.
And right now, you were just telling me that you have two new books that just came out. One is Hitler's Forgotten Children, and the other one is The Yorkshire Ripper, The Secret Murders. Why don't you tell us a little bit about those books?
Well, Hitler's Forgotten Children is the story of a woman who was called Ingrid von Oelhafen. She was kidnapped in 1942 into the Nazi Lebensborn program, which is, when I first found out about this, it's kind of a surprise that it's one of the least known parts of the Nazis' programs. It was a program created by Himmler to create, I suppose, a new Aryan master race. So there was a combination of suitably Aryan babies being born in Lebensborn homes, and others like Ingrid who looked Aryan as babies being kidnapped from all across the countries that Germany overran during the war and brought up in these homes and handed out to suitably Nazi families to be raised as good little Nazis. Ingrid's story is just extraordinary. She's an amazing woman, a truly amazing woman, who has spent 10 to 15 years investigating and tracking down what happened to her, where, and indeed how. And her story, it's the story of post-war Europe as well as what happened to her in the Lebensborn program. And I'm deeply honored to have worked with her and to have been able to write her story.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating topic. You'd think it would be covered more.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that struck me when I first began looking at this. I have to say I made a documentary film about the Lebensborn program just under 2 years ago for British television, and I filmed Ingrid for it. But as I got the material into the edit suite, I was just sitting there with my film editor, and I said, there's just no way we can get Ingrid's story in this because it's just too huge. It's not just Germany, it's the former Yugoslavia, it's what happened there, and the story of how she traced back where she came from and ultimately had this truly awful experience of when she found her original family, her birth family, from whom she'd been kidnapped, to find that they'd been handed another child by the Nazis in her place who had been brought up as her.
Were they aware of that?
It's very hard to tell. Obviously, her birth parents are dead, and by the time she got to find out who they were passed. The person who has been brought up as her doesn't want to talk to Ingrid, but the wider family in what is now Slovenia, have been very supportive, and there have been DNA tests which show that she is who she thinks she is. And they've been incredibly helpful and supportive, but they don't know what Ingrid's birth parents knew.
That's just amazing. I think I saw your film because I am familiar with the story a little bit. And I tell you, it just seems like everything you cover is all the stuff that we're into over here. So thank you for coming, you know.
Well, no, thank you for having me. I have to say, I'm very privileged to be able to tell stories and to be able to tell stories that I think are important and need to be told. And the story of Lebensborn is not just the story of this obscene program and this madness of Himmler's belief in pure Aryan blood, but it reflects on everything really that's happened since the Second World War, where somewhere, someone, somewhere is always saying, always believes that somebody else is worth less than them because they're from a different race or a creed or a color. And that underlying problem has never gone away.
You know, that's so true. And that is so true. And it just seems that this ruling class, you know, that, and again, it sort of fits into this whole theme of all the different stories you've been doing, covering over the years. Like this ruling class that thinks that the rest of us are less human than they are.
Yeah. I mean, it's ruling class is, I think, because it's different classes in different places in different parts of the world over different periods. But there is always this sinister and, in my view, terrible attitude which says, oh, well, we're better than them, they're worse than us, therefore it's okay that we discriminate against them, or we kill them, or we exploit them. And that attitude, I mean, you see it everywhere today still. It hasn't gone away.
Now, that sort of ties into the other book you were talking about, the Yorkshire Ripper. This Peter Sutcliffe, who was friends with Jimmy Savile.
Well, so it appears. He knew he met Jimmy Savile in Broadmoor, a psychiatric hospital where Savile was a visitor. Sutcliffe's story, again, for your listeners in the States, his name probably won't mean as much as it does over here. He was one of Britain's worst serial killers, and for a number of years in the north of the country, he terrorized towns and cities by attacking women at random. Often they were prostitutes, but in many cases they weren't. And the failure to catch him over many years was a deep embarrassment to police forces in that part of the country. And what we've done in this book, I've written it with a former police intelligence officer who began to put together the clues from cold cases, long cold cases, was to show that Sutcliffe is the most likely killer of at least 23 more people. He was convicted of 13. And these 23 cases have just been left unsolved in the files. And yet everything points to him as the most likely killer. And yet this case has been surrounded by extraordinary levels of secrecy, so that evidence has been suppressed and is being hidden, and is still, to this day, he was convicted in 1981 originally, it is still secret in this country.
Now, is he alive today?
Sutcliffe, yeah. He is living in a great deal more comfort than, in my view, he deserves. There was a trial back in 81, and the jury was asked to decide whether he was mad or bad, because he claimed he was mad. And the jury said, no, he's bad, and he needs to go to prison. And he went to prison, but in, again, very secretive procedures. This country is very good at secrecy. He was quietly shifted out of the prison system into the much more comfortable confines of a prison psychiatric hospital. And that's where he's been for the last 30-odd years.
Yeah, and somehow he's getting visits with Jimmy Savile and also this boxing champion as well.
I didn't know the boxing champion. Savile was a very strange man, yeah. And he did have, for reasons which have yet to be fully explained in this country, almost the free run of this psychiatric hospital, Broadmoor, and that's how he came into contact with Sutcliffe.
Right. Now, and if this was in the States here, and there were 23 unsolved murders that were connected to a convicted serial killer, the cops would love to write those off to someone they already had in custody. Now, why wouldn't that be the case over there?
That's a really good question. It's a question we've been asking my colleague and I for, 18 months. And every time we ask that question, and every time we submit our equivalent of one of your FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests, we get a stonewall response saying, we're not telling you.
Really?
Yeah, we could paper the walls with the rejection of our Freedom of Information Act requests.
Well, what do you suspect the reason is? Did he have connections to powerful people?
No, I don't think it is. I think it's much more simple than that. In my view, a lot of these things boil down to the simplest explanation. The investigation, the original investigation of Sutcliffe's crimes was so badly mishandled, partially because the British police or the police force for the region concerned in those times, in the late 70s and early 80s, was, as all police forces in this country were very backward at that point. We didn't have computers. Everything was on a piece of paper. And it was a huge and time-consuming and debilitating investigation, but they did make serious mistakes. What happened thereafter was the prosecution, instead of trying to try Sutcliffe for his crimes, entered into a pretty shabby backdoor plea bargain with him and his lawyers, so that they would allow him to plead guilty, to plead that he was mad, and therefore shouldn't be held accountable. Now, if the prosecution is doing that, that's deeply disturbing. And I think what's happened ever since has been probably a result of embarrassment at firstly the incompetence of the regional police investigation, and secondly, embarrassment within the very senior levels of the prosecution, what is the equivalent, our equivalent of your federal prosecution system, at the way it was duped by Sutcliffe way back in 1981.
Now, was it that he had a really top-notch legal defense team? Could that have been it?
No, I mean, the odd thing for me, and I have to say I lived through this period as a young reporter. I just started as a cub reporter, we used to call them in those days, in the middle of his reign of terror. The odd thing is reading the trial transcripts, which have been difficult to get hold of in this country, again, because of the secrecy. But reading those trial transcripts, it wasn't the defense team that was essentially trying to make life easy for him in the trial. It was the prosecution.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the more bizarre episodes in British prosecution history. On top of that, and which I think this may speak to why this is still such a sensitive and secretive topic for much of this country's judicial and law enforcement. 3 of the cases, the unsolved cases that we've investigated, and we say are almost certainly Sutcliffe's handiwork. 3 entirely innocent men went to prison for those cases, for those killings, and spent 20-something years rotting in cells before courts ruled that they were innocent.
Really?
Now, yeah, and there's no, those men were paid compensation, and not, frankly, nothing could compensate for losing 20 to 25 years of your life. I think that is also feeding into the reluctance of the establishment, if you want to call it that, in this country, to address this.
But they had enough evidence to get convictions, or were they? I guess they weren't guilty pleas, right? They got convictions against these other 3 men. Yeah,
and they browbeat these three men. These were 3 young men. 3 entirely different cases in different parts of the country. In each case, the police browbeat these young men who had severe learning difficulties, and they browbeat them over a number of days into signing bogus confessions, which was soon as they could, they repudiated. And the courts eventually found that these young men, or by the time they found they weren't young anymore, these men had not done these crimes at all.
Fascinating. So here you got the cops basically railroading these three guys for a crime they didn't commit, while they have the guy in custody right now. They're giving him a cushy ride for crimes that he's convicted of, and yet won't even pin the crimes that he's suspected of on him. Yeah,
it is bizarre, isn't it?
Oh, that's a pattern.
And the transfer of this guy, this man Sutcliffe, to a psychiatric hospital there's never been any public discussion of that. There's never been any due process for that. It's done in the people's name, in our name, and we have to foot the bill for it. It costs 10 times as much to keep him there per year as it does to keep him in a prison. And yet all of this has been done in secret.
Frank Bruno was the boxing champ.
Yeah, well, that much I didn't know, so thank you for that. I've got a new piece of information today.
Well, you got to check this out, because there's a picture on Google Images of Frank Bruno being introduced to Sutcliffe, and Jimmy Savile is standing between them with his arms folded, with that arrogant way he has. Sort of like, look what I'm doing here, guys,
Yeah, he was a strange, dangerous, and manipulative man, Jimmy Savile. And as I say, how someone like him could have been given such unrestricted access to what is meant to be one of the most secure prison psychiatric facilities in the country is just bizarre and has yet to be answered.
Now, is that the only psychiatric institution he had access to?
No, I think he had access to Savile, you're talking about, other institutions, though none as high security. None. Broadmoor is pretty much the pinnacle of the prison psychiatric service in this country. He had access to hospitals and other places, and he was an arch manipulator.
Yeah, I've done a couple of shows on Savile. I just had his great niece on the show who describes how when he visited her home when she was 12 years old, she was placed on his lap, and he molested her in front of the whole family. Yeah.
I am aware that a lot of those cases and those are being litigated at the moment, and our legal systems over here is a little more strict and severe than yours over there, and I have to be careful that I don't say anything which could affect the progress of that litigation.
Okay. But now, in general, with the Savile investigation over there, has it pretty much died out, or is there still an uproar?
No, there is still investigations, official investigations going on, not just into Savile, but into the people who had links to Savile, and indeed the institutions that Savile manipulated and abused the trust of are still carrying out their own internal investigations as well.
Yeah, but have any charges been brought about, or any sanctions, or any firings?
No.
Nothing, right? Yeah.
No.
Now, go ahead.
There's one of the organizations is the BBC. Everyone knows the BBC. Savile, it is alleged, abused his position within the BBC to molest women whilst on BBC premises. Now, there is an ongoing, and has been for some time, BBC investigation. It will be interesting to see what results from that.
Well, do you have any hope that something's going to come out of it?
It's very hard to tell. I mean, a lot of this happened a long time ago.
Right.
And the BBC now is a very different organization to the BBC then, and a lot of the people who were there then and who presumably should be asked about it are not employed by the BBC now. That said, and it's a cheap jibe, but there's an element of truth in it. There's an old saying here about the BBC whenever it gets itself into trouble. It's not that heads will roll, but deputy heads will roll.
Gotcha. Yeah, they're just a couple of figureheads, right? The fall guys, they call them here. Fall guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whether that happens, the internal investigation inside the BBC goes on. It goes on quietly and privately, and for all I know, they're doing a fantastic job, and I shall be fascinated to see what emerges.
Okay, let's sit here with bated breath and wait for the outcome of these.
Yeah, so possibly don't hold your breath, because it could be quite some time.
Yeah. Now, what about? Are you familiar with the Jeffrey Epstein conviction here in the United States and his connection to Prince Andrew?
I have seen the newspaper reports, nothing more.
Okay. So now, and how are the reports going now? Is it pretty much died down, or is there still news reports about? The
last I saw was when one of the main claim was kicked out by a judge. That was what was reported here.
Right. That's the last thing you guys received as a report of. There was that Virginia Roberts was not allowed to become a co-plaintiff.
Well, that's the last I've seen. Now,
yeah.
Bear in mind, I haven't been following this.
No, pretty much it's been covered up over there since that ruling. But since then, the plaintiffs in this case have won the victory. And all of this information has to come out. All of the plea negotiations and all the sealed information and discovery is all being released right now. In fact, a ton of it was just released about 3 or 4 days ago.
Well, as I said, I have no knowledge of the case at all. As a general rule, my view is that releasing information and the sunshine, as they always say, has a cleansing effect. And whatever the case, by and large, I think the public has a right to hear the information.
I absolutely agree with you as far as that goes. Now, in your career, am I correct to assume that one of the threads of your career has been investigating, again, victimization of children and women, and also satanic ritual abuse?
Yeah, that's been satanic ritual abuse is always a difficult subject. I mean, I liken it to the third rail of anything to do with child protection, because professionally you touch it and you die. It's such a difficult topic that it's caused me no little difficulty in my career.
Can you elaborate?
Sure. I wrote a book about ritual abuse and satanic ritual abuse, and I was sued by a policeman who was identified in one of the cases which I examined in some detail in the book. And he objected to, this is a book of 100,000 words, he objected to an inference which he said some readers might draw from 4 paragraphs. Now, I had intended no such inference, and if I'm honest, I don't believe any such inference would reasonably have been drawn, but it's very difficult to defend that, and my publishers at that point, for various reasons, decided they couldn't carry on with the fight, and they settled out of court with him, and we made a public apology to him, and he was paid a large sum of money.
That seems to be a pattern with the other side of the ritual abuse topic.
Well, I mean, I do want to stress this policeman was not a bad man.
Right.
This was not, I did not, certainly never intended to imply any slur on him. I don't think the investigation which he ran was very well done, but that happens. It is just a phenomenally difficult problem. It cropped up again here. There have been a couple of cases ongoing here, which I haven't followed. But it cropped up again in the context of a BBC 2-part radio program presented by quite a well-respected columnist, newspaper columnist, and who proceeded to, across this two-part program, suggest that ritual abuse never happens. It's all a nonsense. It's all invented by gullible social workers or religious enthusiasts. And whilst I share some of his concerns that there has been generally very bad newspaper reporting of it, which tends to inflame things, and that some of the claims that have been made can't really be substantiated, what puzzles me in all of this is when I wrote the book, found a series of successful prosecutions of adult men and women in this country, in the United Kingdom, for the sexual abuse of children in what the courts heard were satanic rituals. That pretty much seems to me to answer the question, does it exist or not?
Yeah, very true. And here in the United States as well, we've had many convictions that haven't been tarred and feathered and kind of poo-pooed off the stage.
It is, I think, I work a lot in the States, but I can't speak to the prevailing mood, if you like, about child sexual abuse in the US. But in the UK, the public mood, as reflected in the media, is very ambivalent to reports of child sexual abuse. And we tend to try and shoot the messenger rather than listen to the message or understand the message, let alone investigate the message. And when you amplify that from, forgive the phrase, garden variety child sexual abuse to ritual child sexual abuse, there is virtually no serious, calm, secular examination of this. It polarizes people into one camp who says it's everywhere and everyone's at it, or the other camp who says it doesn't exist and you're all mad. And as ever with these things, the truth is pretty much in between.
Very true, because we know that a lot of it is not organized. A lot of it could just be, people with a fascination or a hobby that are just dabbling in this kind of thing. I'm guessing you've come across the same routine and really rather dull response from people who don't bother to look at facts, but just react by saying it's all nonsense. They talk about conspiracies and conspiracy theories, and at the risk of sounding pedantic, it's probably one of the laziest insults that journalists reach for is conspiracy theory. And it's you're alleging a conspiracy. All a conspiracy is two people saying to one another, should we do this, and doing it. Yeah. And it doesn't have to mean some vast international vertical conspiracy. Yeah, I follow your point there. Exactly. It's just two or three agreeing, conspiring together to commit a crime or to take on an action together in concert.
That's your basic conspiracy. I mean, you don't have to believe in little green men and aliens kidnapping people to say some conspiracies do happen. Frankly, Watergate was a conspiracy, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And any more than two people, you're right. Any kind of agreement between the RICO convictions we have here, organized crime cases, are all conspiracy cases.
Of course they are. Yeah. And that's why it's, as a journalist, I find it disturbing how lazy some of my colleagues are, and they reach typically for this phrase conspiracy theory without ever stopping to think what it means.
And on the other hand, it's very concerning too. People who just like to hype, and like tabloid type journalism, and just kind of...
Yeah, and that, I think I have sort of occasional arguments, public arguments with journalists here who say, when that sort of tabloid accusation comes out, this happened, this person did this in this place, and they're saying this on the basis of one complainant coming to them and saying, this happened to me, this is my story. Now that story could be accurate, it might not be accurate. My argument is, if you're a journalist, a responsible journalist, you don't just publish it, you investigate it before you publish it.
Which brings up the film Conspiracy of Silence. Now, that was about the Omaha, Nebraska, the Boys Town. Now, you were involved with that, or you weren't?
I was. It was my film. I was working for what was then the best place in Britain, the best company in Britain, at making serious documentary films. It was a truly wonderful place to work and a great supportive environment. And it had been making amazing films for the British networks for some years. I joined it, and I was able to make what I think are pretty good films for those networks. At some point, it did a deal with Discovery, the US cable network, which wanted to buy the brand. It's this particular series that we produced of documentary films. And they bought the brand. It was called First Tuesday. And then the whole thing was going to be called First Tuesday on Discovery. And the very first film that Discovery commissioned was Conspiracy of Silence. And they commissioned it, and I remember to the end of my days the phrase of the commissioning editor: it's got politics, it's got pedophilia, it's got everything we want.
But in reality, whenever you have a story or a report that involves pedophilia, it's usually squashed here in the United States.
It's usually what, sorry?
It's usually silenced.
Well, Discovery were very keen. When we put to them for this new strand, this new series that they were going to run First Tuesday on Discovery, we put to them, I think, 13 ideas, and they commissioned only one at first, and that one was Conspiracy of Silence. They were red hot for this. So I and my colleague set off for Nebraska in the summer of 1993 to start investigating.
So can you describe what that story was in Nebraska?
Sure. The story as it was told to me, and it came to me from a freelance who I'd worked with based in LA, and he said, I've got this story, you should look at it. The story is, as he told it to me, and this was the initial allegation that we were going to follow, was that in Nebraska there is America's favorite children's charity, Boys Town, immortalized in the great Spencer Tracy Hollywood movie, Boys Town. And the story was, the allegation was that Boys Town had been subverted in many ways by a man who prostituted children across Nebraska, some from Boys Town, some from other parts of Nebraska, and indeed had trafficked them for prostitution out of Nebraska and into Washington, D.C., where they serviced political clients on the Hill, essentially. That was the allegation. And by the time we got to Lincoln, Nebraska, which is where we set up our base for a month and a half, there were at that point scandal surrounded three young people: a man called Paul Benassi, a young woman called Alicia Owens, and a young man called Troy Bonner. And they had made statements and given evidence both in court and to a Nebraska state investigative committee relating to the abuse of children and sexual abuse and trafficking of children in Nebraska and from Nebraska, and the Boys Town element as well. When we arrived, the first thing that made me deeply suspicious about how honest the law enforcement and judicial system in Nebraska was going to be and had been was the case of Alicia Owen. She was a young woman. She at that point was in prison. She was in prison for the crime of perjury. She'd been sent there by state court, not federal court, state court. And as I looked at this, her crime was naming in court, when asked to do so, her abuser or her alleged abuser. The first tell, if you like, was that her sentence for this was 9 to 27 years. The second tell was that the crime for which she was sentenced didn't actually exist. Under Nebraska state law, not merely was it not a crime to name your abuser when asked in court, it was actually a crime not to name your abuser. So that's where we started.
And that's terrifying.
Yeah, I think so. The stimulus for all this being aired was a man who I thought then, I still think he was, incredibly brave. He was a lawyer called John DeCamp, and some of your listeners may know he's written his own account of this, and you should read his account as well as see what we did. And John represented Paul Benassi, and he was sort of representing Alicia Owen at that point. But there were two key things I needed to do straight away when we got to Nebraska. I needed to speak to Troy Bonner, was one of them, because Troy Bonner was a young man, one of the three who had corroborated the stories of Alicia Owen and Paul Benassi, and indeed described his own abuse. So Troy Bonner was on my to-find list. The other thing I needed to do was to get hold of all the paperwork. Now, I say this with some mild trepidation. I got access to all the state legislators' internal paperwork, all the transcripts, all the tapes, and indeed some the tapes and transcripts of grand jury hearings. Now, I know I'm not supposed to have seen those, but I got hold of them. What they showed, other than very clear and convincing testimony about child sexual abuse in Nebraska, about children being abused at parties, trafficked and traded, not just within Nebraska, but also outside the state, what they showed was that these three young people, Alicia Owens, Paul Benassi, and Troy Bonner, were only the latest of the complainants, if you like. And there was a small number of complainants, of young people who had given evidence to the state investigator, recorded evidence. About 4 years earlier, and they'd been at Boys Town, they described the plundering of Boys Town for children. So I figured that my first thought, I had to find these kids. They'd be young people. And I spent much of the ensuing 6 weeks trying to track them down. It sounds overly dramatic, but they had disappeared from the face of the earth. I knew who they were. I knew where they'd lived. I knew who their relatives were. There was no sign of these young people, not a trace. I hired licensed PIs to try and track them down somewhere in the States. Not a trace. In the end, I found one of them, a young woman whose testimony had been very disturbing. She described what had happened to her, she described where it had taken place, and she also described and gave evidence about parties involving the sexual abuse of children in Washington, D.C. And I finally, and purely by chance, found her late one evening in a pretty poor neighborhood in Nebraska. And she didn't know I was coming. I knocked on the door. And I persuaded her to let me in and just speak with her. She had a couple of kids at that point. And she was very nervous, very, very nervous, and said, "Look, I'll talk to you, but come back tomorrow." And that wasn't an unreasonable request to make. She had young kids to deal with. I agreed and went back the next day, and she'd gone. The house had been cleared.
Wow.
I never found them. But those stories, those originals, they were the first allegations. And the Troy Bonner's story and Alicia Owen's story and Paul Bonassi's story, which matched them, and they had never met. These young people had never met each other across a 4-year period, were very, very similar and named the same people. So I figured I had to find Troy Bonner. And I did. I found Troy, and Troy at that point, it's absolutely fair to say, he had a very, very severe drug dependency. He was a very sick young man. He was very open about his dependency on heroin and crack. And he was a difficult young man. And he was difficult partly because of the drug dependency, but also because he was terrified. And the story ran that he had given corroborating testimony which backed up what Paul Bonassi, or some of what Paul Bonassi and Alicia Owens had said. He had then been persuaded to withdraw and recant that testimony and to say that it had all been a gigantic hoax and he'd made it up. The three of them had made it up. And that's where the situation lay when I arrived in Nebraska. And for me, it was a pretty simple question. Well, which is it? Which is true? Was his original testimony true, or was the recantation true? And when I tracked him down, he was really, really scared. And over a lengthy period, I got to know him very well. And I got to know his family. And beneath the dependency and beneath this difficult young man was a genuinely nice human being, a good human being, who had, partly through his own fault, partly not, got into some pretty nasty circumstances. And the story he told me was that his original testimony, that the abuse had happened, was true, but that he had been threatened by, amongst others, and most predominantly, the FBI, to recant his testimony. And that the FBI had told him that if he didn't, he would be prosecuted for perjury and would spend a long time in prison, and that was not a good place for someone dependent on illegal substances to be. I persuaded, well, the first thing was, I said, well, I couldn't understand why the FBI, A, was involved and B, was doing this. And I wasn't about to take Troy's word for it. So I went back to the room full of documents and storage boxes, and eventually I unearthed an audio recording which the state legislature had been given, which was, in my view, extraordinary. It was a recording that had been made by the FBI agents who identified themselves on the tape at the start. And they had dragged Troy Bonner into an office and got him to ring up Alicia Owen in prison to try and persuade her to back down on what she was saying. It was the most extraordinary tape, and it certainly supported what Troy alleged about the pressure from the FBI. And so I persuaded Troy that the safest thing for him to do, the way to free himself from the pressure he was under, was to give us a filmed interview, which he did. And I have to say, it's something that I've lived with, and I blame myself for having done ever since.
Because he's turned up dead now?
Yeah. I persuaded Troy that the safest thing for him to do was to give a filmed interview, because once his story was told, once it was broadcast,
right,
there would be no real mileage for anybody in trying to persecute him. We made the film. It took the best part of 9 months to make the film, to shoot the film, to do the research. We took it back, all the footage back to England, to our offices, to this television company we worked for. And this was all shot on 16mm film, so large cans of film. We edited the film over many weeks, my colleague and I, and we produced what's called a rough cut. Again, if your listeners presumably are familiar with this, a rough cut is your first version of the film. And when things are edited on film, it looks scratchy, and there's bits of yellow chalk mark on it and bits of tape sticking things together. And we produced that. We took it to Discovery. And at that point, Discovery had already been promoting the film in the TV magazines in the States. So it was in the schedules, and we had, I think, a week left, or 10 days left, to take it from true cut to fine cut, which is pretty much the last stage before you lock the whole thing off. And Discovery, at that point, pulled out. And I, again, will remember to the end of my days the reason they gave.
Okay.
They said, and I quote, "We seem to have gotten into an investigative area which is inconsistent with the Discovery mission statement." End quotes.
Now, that as well is terrifying.
I've heard a lot of theories as to why Discovery would do this. I have no idea which, if any of them, are accurate. All I know is they pulled out of the film. They said they had paid at that point something like $250,000 for this film. They handed it back to the television company for whom I worked and said, "You can do that, what the hell you want with this, provided you never associate Discovery's name with it." Frankly, no one else was, no British television station was going to broadcast a film which was purely American in scope. Not of that ilk. So there it stuck. I mean, and the film never progressed beyond rough cut. And I know someone leaked it, and it's been put up on YouTube, and it's had an enormous number of hits on YouTube. But what you see on the YouTube version of the film is our rough cut. There are bits missing. You can see the places where there's a slate saying library footage needed or archive film needed. But it still gives a pretty good idea of what we had. The outcome, the upshot, of all of this, I'd promised Troy that he would be safe because it would be broadcast. It wasn't broadcast. Troy disappeared, and yes, sure enough, I think 6 months or a year later, he turned up dead. Now, I have no means of knowing whether his death, as was quite likely, was the result of a drug overdose, or whether it was something else. What I do know is that I let him down.
All right. Let me ask you this, though. What do you think the FBI's motivation was to silence this story?
The answer is I simply don't know. One of the things for old dinosaur journalists like me that you have hammered into you in your early days is never attribute motive to somebody unless you actually know that motive.
Right.
I think it's a good question to ask the FBI. We asked the FBI, and for any of your listeners who check the film out on YouTube, you'll hear the result of that phone call on the film. We asked the FBI for an interview, and they basically told us to go to hell.
Now, the young woman who you went to her apartment, and you said she lived in a poor neighborhood. Yeah,
a really low-rent neighborhood.
Okay, so now, when you went back the next day, were all of her possessions removed from that home?
Well, the house was locked up, and I spent a little time looking through the windows, and there was no sign of anything in any of the rooms that I could see. The sort of things you would expect, kids' toys, they weren't there.
And the night before, when you were at the door, you could look inside and see that there was a...
I was inside.
Oh, you were inside? So obviously all of her possessions were removed.
Well, as far as I could see through the windows, yeah.
Gotcha. Now, she wouldn't be a person who would have the means to hire movers in the middle of the night and to find a new location to live and put her stuff in storage.
I would think that is unlikely, but I can't rule that out, The most benign explanation I can come up with is that my presence, my arrival on her doorstep, this is a very rundown, low-rent, almost exclusively black neighborhood. I'm a, middle-class, middle-aged, white English guy turning up, asking questions about something very sensitive that happened, evidence she gave 4 years ago. The best guess that I can come up with is that my presence frightened her so much that she just somehow got all her stuff up and went. That's the most benign explanation I can come up with.
Right. And you're trying to give everybody the benefit of the doubt.
Well, as we've talked about, I don't think it helps to jump to dramatic conclusions. I like to look at evidence and sift evidence. And where there's a hole in the evidence, and in most cases you're going to find holes in the evidence, I think it's only honest to say there's a hole in the evidence.
Very good. Very good. Now, but your impression of this Omaha, Nebraska end of this story was that it was much larger and far more organized and had to involve some powerful people behind it in order to get this kind of pushback against you, correct?
Well, the allegations were that the then rising, in the 80s, the rising hope of the Black Republican Party, Black Hope in the Republican Party, a man called Lawrence King,
right,
who'd sung the national anthem at one of the Republican conventions in the mid-80s. He had infiltrated himself into one of the credit unions in Nebraska and and this much is proven fact, had made off with some of its funds, a large proportion of its funds. They disappeared. And he subsequently went to prison for, I think, 15 years for that. The allegation from the young people was that he had been the moving force in providing children for abuse, both in Nebraska and particularly in flying them across to D.C.
Right. Let me ask you, did you personally receive any kind of threats or kind of intimidation over this case?
I can't answer that definitively. We believed that at one point we were being followed.
Okay.
I can't prove that. I'm not a counter-surveillance specialist in any way, shape, or form. But my colleagues and I, because I wasn't out there on my own, we believed at one point we were towards the end of our filming, that we were being followed. And not in a particularly subtle way.
That was in Nebraska.
Mm-hmm. Other people, if you talked to the people who are still around from that time, will tell you they did feel threatened. The state legislature had hired an investigator, a man called Gary Caradori.
Okay.
And it was his files, not through him or not through his family, that I got access to them, which had provided such a wealth of material, amongst others. Gary Caradori had died in to the best of my knowledge, still slightly unexplained plane crash, light aircraft accident. Officials in the state took that as a message. Now, I have no idea. I can't prove one way or the other. Certainly, his family believed it had not been an innocent accident, and certainly some of the state officials believed that.
Now, I've had Henry Vinson on my show.
Sorry, say again?
I've had Henry Vinson, the author of Confessions of a D.C. Madam, and he was involved with Larry King, and also Craig Spence. He's been involved in his story. Are you familiar with his book?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
I have to say that the whole, once Discovery pulled out,
right,
the company that I worked for said, you're going to have to work on something else because, it had to pay the rent. So I haven't looked really at the Nebraska story for 20-something years. I have had contact with people who say they are Troy Bonner's family, who have been very nice in emails to me saying I shouldn't blame myself, but it's not going to change things. I will always blame myself for that. But I haven't looked at it since then.
Well, Henry Vinson was connected with Larry King and also Craig Spence.
Craig Spence and the Callboy Network certainly was something we came across and dealt with, yes. Right.
Well, Craig Spence allegedly had Secret Service agents as his bodyguard.
Again, it's impossible for me to say anything useful about that. Okay. All I know is that at the time when we were dealing with it, all credit card records which had been seized relating to one of the particular callboy networks in D.C. with which King was allegedly involved, all of those records had been sealed.
And could those be the credit card records that Henry Vinson talks about that were going through his funeral home?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I'm sorry not to be more help on that. All I know is that we wanted to get access to them, and we weren't the only ones. There were other journalists trying to get access to them, but a court had sealed them, and they were never going to be unsealed.
Interesting. Interesting that would be sealed when you had access to so much of this other information.
In fairness, courts do seal records.
Sure.
It does happen. It's happened in other cases I've worked on. It doesn't help find the truth, I don't think. In this case, it certainly didn't help find the truth. And it didn't help the young people in question.
Now, looking back, though, a lot of people nowadays, when they talk about the Franklin case and Boys Town and Larry King and all these characters, did you have any chance to run across Ted Gunderson in that investigation?
I've run across Ted Gunderson in another investigation.
Okay.
I'm trying to cast my mind back whether I came across him in connection with Franklin, and honestly, I cannot remember.
But now John DeCamp, he's former Central Intelligence Agency. DeCamp
was former special. I didn't know. I'm not sure he was CIA. John was very open about being part of Operation Phoenix, but the Phoenix program rather, in Vietnam in the early '60s, and was close to the then director of the CIA. And in fact, he's on our film. John was, and I think this was one of the things I found remarkable about John. John was a Republican, a lifelong Republican, and all of this involved the Republican Party. So he was, in that sense, he was dirtying his own political nest. And he had been a state senator, and he had been a very high-flying and well-paid lobbyist after that. And by championing the cases of Alicia Owen and Troy Bonner, who briefly represented, and Paul Bonassi, it basically ruined him. And he wasn't the only one.
Yeah, he's very hard to get a hold of right now. But now, it says here that he was an aide to former CIA Director William Colby. But now you're saying that he was part of Operation Phoenix in Vietnam?
John was very open with me about, and I think he's been open elsewhere, about being part of the Phoenix program.
Really? Okay, I'm not familiar with that he ever talked about that. I just interviewed Doug Valentine, who wrote the book about the Phoenix program. And he didn't mention DeCamp, but I guess it didn't come up. I'll have to talk with him about that.
Well, I mean, John was not, this wasn't an unguarded moment. We talked about it long and hard, and we talked about it again when I made a film, utterly unrelated film, about Vietnam and about the end of the war and what happened to orphans at the end of the war in Saigon. And John certainly was not shy about his involvement in Phoenix, and I think to the best of my memory, he had mixed feelings about it.
Okay. Well, I would hope so. Now, so people who look back now at this Boys Town scandal and come to the conclusion that perhaps John DeCamp was a gatekeeper and was taking control, he was handling this investigation as sort of a cover-up. You would not endorse that kind of a theory?
It's one of those, this is where people veer off into their own suppositions.
Okay.
I never saw anything which led me to believe that John wasn't 100% sincere. Now, if there is evidence which points to the contrary, then I just didn't see it then, and I haven't, as I say, I haven't followed this case since. I haven't seen it since.
Okay. Now, very interesting. Now, you said that you ran into Ted Gunderson in another story. What was that?
That was the ritual abuse.
With a Keno.
It wasn't a Keno. It was the McMartin preschool case. John was involved. Ted was involved in some aspect of part of the investigation into that, and that's where I ran across him. I know that I ran across him in dealing with that.
Okay, well, can you describe you did a story about the McMartin case?
The McMartin case featured in the book that I wrote, the one which was sued.
The same one? Okay.
And because the book examined evidence not just from the UK, but from other parts of the world. And so I looked at McMartin and I talked to some of the families.
Okay, and now, did you ever come to a conclusion on that? A lot of people try to dismiss it and poo-poo it, what was your conclusion?
I think it's impossible to come to a final conclusion because so much of the evidence has either been destroyed or the waters have been muddied. I don't want to say anything because I have no reason to say it, to suggest that the court decisions in that were wrong. What I would say is that the sort of knee-jerk reaction and dismissal of the children's stories, one part of them, there was and you must have heard this and other people will have heard this, the kids talked about tunnels, and there weren't any tunnels, therefore the whole thing was nonsense. And the truth is, that isn't the truth. There was an independent scientist hired by the parents who went down and found the tunnels pretty much exactly where the kids said they were, and found items in there which were consistent with what the kids said. And to the best of my knowledge and belief, those tunnels have now been filled in or destroyed. But there is a formal report to that effect. And the reason why I say that it's impossible to come to a conclusion on any of these cases is that these very old and celebrated cases, is that the evidence has been so muddied, or in some cases destroyed, that it's virtually impossible to reach unequivocal conclusions.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, another story you did, though, involved Michael Aquino.
Well, yes and no. Michael Aquino was part of, before the book on ritual abuse, I was the researcher for what was turned out to be not a very good film about Satanism and ritual abuse. And we filmed Michael Aquino for that.
Now, how difficult? That was just right at the start of the accusations against him at the Presidio.
The accusations had been made, and I think the internal judge advocate general procedures, if that's what they were still ongoing at that point.
Now, I watched a bit of that interview. It's available. It was just put on YouTube just very recently. There's only
really? I haven't seen that for the best part of 30 years.
I'll send it to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the interview, he was and Lilith, his wife, were very aggressive with the interviewer.
Yeah, they were not pleased to be asked about this.
Yeah, now how did that come about? What made them agree to come on in the first place?
Aquino was then running something called the Temple of Set.
Right.
And it had recently established a British branch of the Temple of Set, which was run by a British Satanist who was amenable to talking to me and indeed gave us an interview. And through him, it was suggested that Aquino, if we paid, and we did, the television station did pay for his flight and accommodation, he would come over and talk about Satanism and what he wanted to do with the Temple of Set.
So for a very small compensation, he exposed himself in the middle of an investigation?
That is what happened.
Okay, now when things started getting testy in that interview, because he is a guy with considerable military influence and power within the U.S. military, did he have bodyguards with him? What was that like? No, there were no bodyguards. Absolutely none. Absolutely no bodyguards, right?
It was him, Lilith, and as I say, this man called David Austin, who then led the British branch of the Temple of Set.
Now, he's very litigious. Did they threaten you with a lawsuit or any kind of... How did it end up at the end of the interview? Okay, hey, let's, shook hands. Let's go out for a pint. What happened?
Yeah. Do you know, I wish I could remember.
Okay.
And the simple truth is I can't. This was 1989, so what are we... That's 26 years past, and there's been a lot of film through the gate and a lot of books through the presses since then. And I honestly cannot remember how did we part on a happy note over a gin and tonic or a pint of beer. I honestly can't remember.
Now, like you said, 40 years of doing this kind of work and hard-hitting topics. This is serious business. Do you regret anything over the 40 years of taking this road, this hard road?
Yeah. As we've discussed, I deeply regret persuading Troy Bonner that he would be safe if he gave us an interview. I don't see how I can ever reconcile that, because the fact is that he wasn't safe, and that because the film wasn't broadcast, he was even more unsafe, and he certainly felt unsafe. I regret that. I regret that the book on ritual abuse had to be withdrawn. I think it's still, you can get second-hand copies on Amazon, but I think there is useful information in there. I think it's the only time that someone has attempted to take a serious, forensic, secular look at these allegations and to try and sift the wheat from the chaff. I regret that that's no longer there. Do I regret anything else than that personally for me? No. I mean, I'm incredibly fortunate that I have been able and funded to make films and write books about stories and issues that I think need to be told. And people may say, well, that's a very arrogant thing. Why should you get the money just to make the films you think need to be told? But that's the best I can do.
Now, what projects are you working on right now that you have coming up in the future?
Well, I've just had these 2 books out, and I had a film out at the same time, so I was actually writing 2 books and making a film all at the same time. So you've caught me taking a breath.
Okay.
For the first time in 9 months, and really rather enjoying it.
Now, looking back over your career, is there a story that you covered that you wish had gotten more public attention and something that's really important to you that you wish more people knew about?
Yeah, 2. There are 2. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why they haven't had more attention. The first was a film about the assassination of Bobby Kennedy.
Okay.
Now, I'm not a Kennedy nut. I have no views or expertise on the assassination of Jack Kennedy. But in 1988 it was, someone approached me and said, somebody needs to look at the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. And I said, well, it was Sirhan. He's serving life in Soledad for this. And they said, well, no, not really. There's a lot more to it. And at that point, one of the first things that I came up against was that all the files, and I mean all the files, all the evidence, was still under seal. This is 1988. Finally, by 1990, it had been released to the Sacramento State Archive, the California State Archive in Sacramento, and I think I was probably one of the first people in there going through this. And it was one of those moments where I just sat back and I thought, why on earth is no one else concerned about this? And I said that for a very simple reason. Again, I don't know, your listeners will almost certainly know this better than anyone in the UK. Bobby Kennedy was shot in 1968 in the pantry of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He'd just given an acceptance speech. He'd won the California primary. That was pretty much going to put him on track to be the Democratic presidential candidate in 68, and he would, I think it's commonly accepted, have wiped the floor with Nixon. He was shot in the pantry. Sirhan was in the pantry and had a gun and was jumped on and apprehended, but Bobby died pretty much on the floor there. And that's kind of the Wikipedia version of events. What the documents, all the investigative documents which I found showed was that Sirhan physically could not have shot Bobby Kennedy. And the reason is that every single witness, and there were 17 of them, placed Sirhan in the pantry in front of Bobby Kennedy, and the closest his arm with a gun in it ever got to Kennedy was 3 feet. The autopsy report, which hadn't been put into what limited trial proceedings there had been, and which was finally, as I say, released to the State Archives 20-something years later, showed that Kennedy had been shot from a distance of no more than 3 inches from behind his right ear. Sirhan physically could not have done that. And I went and I found the coroner who carried out the autopsy. Tom Noguchi was known as the coroner to the stars.
Right.
And Noguchi was an old man by then. He's dead now. And he said, "No, you're absolutely right." And I said that at the time, and he did. And no one paid any attention. And so in 1991, I think, I made this film, and I dug up an enormous amount of material and eyewitnesses. And the behavior of Los Angeles police was bizarre through this. And once you show that Sirhan couldn't have done it, and Sirhan, bear in mind, has no memory of this, you have to ask the question, well, if he didn't do it, who did? And that's where it got very interesting, because there had been any amount of testimony which should have pointed the LAPD to look for the real killers. And they didn't just ignore it. They studiously shut it down. They threatened people. They threatened witnesses. And they destroyed evidence. And they locked up evidence. And we made the film. It was broadcast on A&E in the States and over here on Channel 4. And we showed quite plainly what had happened. And I also dug up audio tapes, which somebody else had once had, which showed why it had happened and who had been involved. And yet that story doesn't really get told these days. And I don't understand why.
And they actually just in the past 10 years or so demolished the entire Ambassador Hotel, which was, if anything, an architectural landmark, besides.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when I was there filming in LA, it was all shuttered up and behind big wire enclosures, and you couldn't get at it. But that this man, and I'm a child of our era, I suppose. Bobby Kennedy was, even on this side of the Atlantic, a symbol of hope.
Right.
That this man was murdered, and the man who is serving out his days in prison just simply could not and did not do it. And with what we discovered about who was almost certainly behind it, then I find it astonishing that so little attention is paid to that.
Well, who did you conclude was behind it?
This is where, when I say the three letters, people are going to say, oh, God, here goes a conspiracy theory. What we said was the evidence pointed to the CIA, and here's why. Okay. The CIA had, and I know this to be a fact because I have the documents, the CIA's own documents, had in the early and mid-1950s been working on a program, and this is their phrase, to create a robot assassin, end quotes. They called it Project Artichoke. Now, it sounds the stuff of fiction, but I actually got no great feat because you could do that through feeding information. I got the documents in which the CIA described what they were trying to do, which was to create a hypno-programmed assassin who would kill either a visiting head of state or a U.S. politician. This is their documents, not me saying this. And I also found the document in which the director of the program reports having made it work, having the success of it. And he reports this quite mundanely. But he says, yeah, it's working now. We can do this. Now, they had that program. They also, it is a fact, had contracted several hundred, possibly a couple of thousand psychiatrists, independent psychiatrists. Again, this is not speculation. It's not conspiracy theory. It is fact. It's documented in their own documents. And they were paying them to carry out experiments with hypnoprogramming. One of them was a man called William J. Bryan. And I found audio tapes of him in which he essentially put himself in the position he described hypnoprogramming Sirhan.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
This was Sirhan's therapist?
Sirhan had visited him, yes.
Okay.
He wasn't in long-standing therapy. Sirhan wasn't a hugely rich man.
Right. Now, are you familiar with a document? It's an immigration and naturalization police report that describes Sirhan attending parties with the Process Church of the Final Judgment, the Satanic cult?
No, I'm not. I haven't seen it. I would be very interested to see that. I certainly have had a long-standing, if somewhat tangential, interest in the Process Church.
So I'll send you that document. It also talks about how connections to Manson and all kinds of stuff. And but what
I think that the connections between Manson and the Process Church are well documented. There's little doubt about that.
Right.
I haven't seen anything I hadn't heard of anything until you've mentioned this, which links Sirhan to them. Again, I say it as gently as I can. I like to look at documents. I like to look at facts, times, dates, places. So I'd be very interested in seeing that.
You got it. It's going to be on its way. Oh, also to that link to the your own YouTube video that you haven't seen in 30 years with the Aquino's interview. But now, what do you make of the Process Church? When I see them, again, it's that same thread that seems to be flowing through everything. I've interviewed Mayor Jim Rothstein, who was a NYPD detective who spent a great deal of his career investigating the Process Church, and we seem to both agree that they have their hand in a lot of major events in the past 20, 30 years. What do you think?
Well, again, bear in mind that when I was looking at the Process Church, it's in the late 80s, basically through early 1990. And so my information is old. Certainly in the 60s, the Process Church was very active on both sides of the Atlantic and had some very high-profile acolytes. I came across it again here in the UK in 1989 when it issued or published what essentially was a recruiting piece in an occult magazine here in the UK.
Right.
And that's why, again, I became interested in it. You know, it's again, for me, it was very hard to know whether this was basically a bunch of mid-60s, late 60s crazies, or whether it was a bunch of mid-60s, late 60s crazies who were quite well connected.
Did you ever come to a conclusion?
No. Again, I keep coming back to the same thing. For me to come to a conclusion, I need to see and find documentary evidence, and I couldn't and didn't, is the answer.
And I definitely appreciate that, and I respect that very much. Have you ever read Maury Terry's book?
Yeah, I have.
Okay, now what do you make of all of that?
Again, I haven't read it for 30 years, or nearly 30 years. I found it interesting. For me, if you're serious as a federal law enforcement organization, and someone comes up with evidence like this, as Maury Terry did, you know, you should be looking at this and you should be saying, with an open mind, is this true? Is this factual? Or is this a little bit tangential? Is there evidence to support this? I don't know whether the FBI ever did that. I certainly think they should have done.
Well, you know, his work did result in the conviction of the murderers of Roy Raden and those Larry Flint bodyguards who killed Roy Raden, who was a member of the process and involved in all that stuff as well. So they have taken a look at a lot of his work. I'm involved in a discussion group with Maury Terry on a daily basis, and the man who runs the group is a retired FBI agent. So it seems like they know about it. You know, what they're doing about it, I don't know, but it seems like they know at least. And it might interest you to know, too, that this group, the Process Church, the original members, are still together in Utah running a group, an animal rescue foundation that has reportedly a $40 million budget.
That's a nice large slice of money, isn't it?
Yeah, it would kind of point to that they do have friends in high places. And
well, they certainly would appear to have friends with long pockets.
Right, yeah. Oh, my goodness. Well, it definitely seems like we're definitely interested in the same topics, that's for sure.
You asked me if there was another film that or another story which I'd done, which I was slightly puzzled had not made more of an impact. And there is. And I think when you originally contacted me, you mentioned this. I made a film about Alfred Kinsey.
Right.
And again, for me, you know, I'm 60 years old. Kinsey, you know, I grew up in the 60s. Kinsey was someone to be revered because he broke the repressive sex laws, to put it crudely. But when someone, again in the late 90s, brought me this story, I just could not believe what they were telling me. And so I went away and checked it out. And the story they told me, and it is absolutely factually correct, is that Kinsey conspired and contracted with a small group of pedophiles to abuse children and to present reports from these pedophiles of the abuse of children as the first, and I use his phrases, scientific data proving that children were sexual beings from birth and that they could, with the right adult stimulation, enjoy sex with adults almost from birth. Now, I found that an extraordinary thing, and I went and I checked, and there it is. It's chapter 5 of the very first and most famous Kinsey book, Sexuality in the Human Male. And there in black and white are tables describing the manipulation, I think is his word, of children by an adult to orgasm. These children are from 4 months old, in some cases over a 24-hour period. Now, what those tables are describing and what Kinsey's describing is the sexual assault on hundreds of children, and that's bad enough. What I found even more disturbing is that this, quotes, scientific conclusion, end quotes, that children are sexual from birth and can enjoy sexual relationships with adults, that conclusion only stems from those paedophiles' reports. Now, would you necessarily believe a paedophile's description of whether a child was enjoying being abused? I don't think you would, and it's certainly not scientific. But it's formed the basis of public policy throughout much of the Western world ever since. If you talk to people in the sexology business or the sex education business, they will say to you, oh yeah, children are sexual from birth. They can enjoy sexual relationships with adults. Well, how do you know? Well, Kinsey says so. Right. Well, no, Kinsey didn't say so. A group of very dangerous pedophiles said to Kinsey, this is what we've done, and guess what? The kids really enjoyed it. And that is the basis of public policy for the last 70 years. I think that's terrifying.
I think you're talking about Dr. Judith Reisman. Brought you that information?
Well, Judith did the first work on this, and I've known Judith for 30 years, and she and I disagree on just about every topic you could possibly imagine. Judith comes from the Christian right, even though her origins are Jewish communist. And I'm an old-fashioned, unrepentant, unreconstructed socialist.
Yeah, me too, yeah.
I will never change. I am a socialist, and I will go to my grave a socialist. And Judith and I disagree on just about everything, except this. What the work she did exposing Kinsey and exposing what he had done with those pedophiles and what those pedophiles had done on his behalf, I think is first-class work, and she should be applauded for that. Now, I will argue with her until 7 times from Sunday about just about everything else, but not about that.
Plus, she's an adorable woman. You know, I love Judith. I had her on the show, and again, myself too. I'm a socialist myself as well. You know, an old lefty from Manhattan, Lower East Side, with the yippies and protests and all kind of stuff like that. But I love Judith Reisman, and I had her on the show. I just the spunk of that woman.
As I say, I disagree with just about everything she says on just about everything else, and she thinks I'm an absolute loon because she disagrees with just about everything I say. But on this single topic, on Kinsey, she's absolutely right. And when we made the film, I made this film, and it caused quite a stir over here. And then a year or so later, Hollywood releases a biopic of Kinsey, which is this great fawning biopic with Liam Neeson. Right. No mention of any of this. And the same goes for the Masters of Sex, which I think was HBO, was it not?
I'm not familiar with the Masters of Sex, but I'm definitely familiar with the Kinsey movie. We discussed that as well. And just there's so many facets of Kinsey's life. This thing about how he circumcised himself in his own bathtub. And worse besides. Yeah. I always find myself in the middle on these things because I think a lot of the work or the effect of Kinsey was incredibly beneficial. I don't think anyone sensible should argue that the sort of repressive sex laws which America and indeed the UK and much of Europe had
prior to Kinsey were a good thing. I mean, they were appalling, the treatment of gay men and women. And I was reminded the other day when I was talking to somebody about this, there was a law prior to Kinsey in one state which made it a criminal offense to laugh during sex.
Oh, really?
Now, that sort of absurdity absolutely needed to be got rid of. But what he did and what he was responsible for with those children and the effect on public policy ever since is deeply reprehensible.
You know, I think every woman I've had sex with has laughed at me. But what what I wanted to ask you, though, are you familiar with the stuff she uncovered about Kinsey's fascination with Aleister Crowley? And
no, Julie hasn't told me that. No, I'm not familiar with that.
And also, too, that Kenneth Anger. Are you familiar with Kenneth Anger?
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar that he would go to Kinsey's home and do films in his attic?
I think I'm familiar with that. Bear in mind, I'm dredging the depths of my mind. I mean, the antics that took place in Kinsey's attic and were filmed were, well, they were pretty extraordinary. Whether Kenneth Anger was there, I don't know. I have no first-hand evidence on that.
Right, and there's a fascinating photograph, too, where Kinsey was in a classroom with little kids, and I think he passed around a dead rabbit or something. Are you familiar with that?
No, but again, very little surprises me about Kinsey.
Yeah.
What does surprise me is that no one has really taken notice of this. It's kind of the Emperor's New Clothes thing, isn't it? You know, it's the little somewhere there's a little boy, and it's either Judith or me saying, "Look, this guy, this guy isn't wearing clothes. This is a deeply dangerous man."
And now, why do you think that is? Do you think that there's a force behind the media that has an agenda that they want to get out, or you just think it's incompetence, it's just a little bit of this, a little bit of that? What have you come up with after all these years?
Again, I always, as I said to you before, I try not to impute motive. But what I think is you can do, and you unquestionably do, is show that there is a fairly clear connection between Kinsey and Hefner. I mean, Hefner describes it himself, and Hefner set out to proselytize all of the Kinsey agenda and all the Kinsey message. And that fed into a time where the world was ready to hear that. There was a genuine need for sexual liberation, in my view, just not of adults abusing children.
But it does seem to be a byproduct because of the sexual revolution. Because then we have more acceptance now of that kind of thing. The group NAMBLA came out of that movement and stuff.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of movements. It's what I've in other books I've written about these, and loosely I think you can call it the Pedophile International, the Pedophile International, and it's a fairly aggressively vocal group of pedophiles who demand pedophile liberation. And there are two key elements to that. The first is they always cite Kinsey. They always cite this great conclusion from scientific data, not scientific data, that children are sexual from birth. And they hitched themselves onto sort of classic entryist tactics, the legitimate sexual revolution.
Right.
And so they portrayed themselves as being as much victimized as gay men were victimized. And people fell for that. People fell for that in the 70s and 80s. And to some extent, they still do.
But now, Tim, we can't ignore this because here you have like your whole life. You got the Franklin story with the Boys Town, and it reaches the politics in Washington, D.C. with powerful politicians involved in an interest in sex with children. Then you have Aquino, his allegations against him. Here's a guy at the highest level of the military. And you have all this, and then you have this social almost programming an agenda to say, well, this is all okay. Let's cover up for Kinsey's behavior. We legitimize Kinsey. Now, we can't look at all this. I know you don't want to come to conclusions, but we can't look at all this and just say, well, this is all by accident.
No, but one of the things that I've learned, if I've learned anything, is that you should never look for a single reason for anything.
Okay.
Generally, in my experience, when you try and find a reason, what you actually are looking at is a fairly tangled mat of threads that have come together and coalesced. Can threads coalesce? I mix metaphors, but that's what I think you get what I'm getting at.
Yes.
And again, you may or may not be aware that over here at the moment, there is a great deal of excitement and indeed a couple of official inquiries into whether there have been very powerful VIP pedophiles protected within Parliament and the judiciary and the security services. Now, those allegations are being investigated. I would be surprised if they come to any firm conclusion because the evidence is long gone. But it shouldn't really surprise anyone that some members of the judiciary or some members of the security services or some members of the Houses of Parliament are sexually attracted to children because it cuts across all professions, jobs, classes, religions. You're going to find that anywhere.
And you don't think there's a higher percentage of those in power that have this bizarre interest?
I've not seen any evidence which would support that, and I'm not sure that you could ever find that evidence, and that's not because it's impossible. It's hidden because these people are allegedly powerful or in positions of power. It's because as a society we do so little research into pedophilia. We do so little work in working with the men who abuse children to find out why they did it, what drove them to do it. We basically just say they're bad guys and we lock them up. And if you don't talk to them and you don't listen and study and try and understand, that doesn't mean you have to approve, but you do need to understand, then I don't think you can ever find out enough to come to a conclusion about the prevalence of it within any social group or strata.
Here in the States, we don't even lock them up very long. The average child rapist gets 8 years, and they serve about 3.5 years of an 8-year sentence for molesting a child here in the States.
If you think that's bad, brace yourself.
I don't want to hear it. Go ahead.
You don't want to hear it?
Go ahead.
I worked on a story last year. It was a child pornography case. I wrote a book about child pornography back in 1990, so it's been a long-standing issue that I've worked on.
Okay.
This was a young man in the north of England was prosecuted for possession of child pornography. He had apparently been dealing, but they couldn't prove that, and possession is viewed as less serious than trading in it.
Right.
But when the police got hold of his computers, the material they found, one of the films showed a young girl, an underage girl, being abused and being killed. And this is not me saying this. This is what the police said. This is what the prosecutor said. And this is what the judge said when this young man was finally prosecuted. That's what it showed. Two things, and the two reasons I got involved in the story. The young man in question, the sentence he received was 8 months.
Wow.
The second reason I got involved was that the victim and her abuser, killer, were both identifiable. We, under our international obligations in Britain, we work very closely with ICE, and we are meant to send that material because ICE has the best victim and perpetrator facial identifying software in the world. For 16 months, that tape sat on the shelf in a local police station. No one did anything with it.
Well, and so what has come about the case now?
Nothing. The guy is out. He served 4 months. After I published this story, the police said, oh, yes, we will send it on. Now, I'm hoping that it has arrived with ICE, and I'm hoping that ICE are doing something with it, because whatever else, even though the victim appears to be dead, the perpetrator almost certainly isn't. And if he's doing that, he's not going to stop doing that. And someone needs to arrest him.
Again, just horrific, and another terrifying story.
Yeah, welcome to my life.
Yeah. Now, you're over there in the UK. I'm sure you're familiar with this story about these two Hampstead children making these allegations on this videotape. What do you make of that?
I've seen briefly reports of that. I have absolutely no knowledge about it.
Right. And again, it seems to be that some people have run with it, and others are just poo-pooing it and dismissing it right from the gate. Two things that you detest.
Yeah, I mean, again, I haven't looked at it. I haven't investigated it. But what frustrates me, is, and this is just a generic problem, is there is so much noise. There are two sides shouting at each other in all of these cases. And instead of doing the logical and obvious thing, which is to say, well, what's the evidence? Let's have a look at the evidence. And if it stacks up, then, okay, we've got a case. If it doesn't stack up, we haven't. But because the debate, the public debate, consists of people from either side of the argument shouting at each other, then the serious, quiet, sensible forensic investigation really doesn't get done.
Oh, okay. Right, you're right. It seems to be like almost in everything that comes up nowadays, there's this immediate rush to judgment. And people setting up sides. Now, what do you make of someone with your experience and your sobriety in this field? What do you make of these YouTube investigators and these YouTube documentaries that are being put out like almost on the fly with some of the most wildest accusations out there? You must be terrified when you see that.
No.
No?
It's going to happen. I mean, you have to be practical and realistic about this. Okay. This is an internet-connected world where people are going to do this. It's pretty cheap for people to go and make brief films or video clips. And in this globalized world, there's no way you're going to stop that. But then, we've pretty much always had that sort of thing going on. It's just that it's been amplified now. For my money, that's not the real problem. I think it's a distraction. Okay. The real problem is that the police, the law enforcement here, is grossly underfunded and undertasked in dealing with child sexual abuse. Grossly. I mean, it is spectacularly underfunded and undertasked. And secondly, that the newspapers and television stations that I grew up working for and who supported the sort of investigations that we've talked about don't do that anymore. And what that does is it leaves the field open to people who want to shout allegations without necessarily doing the careful investigation which should underpin work. I think, if you want to pin blame on my trade, journalism, because newspapers and television have stopped doing what we used to do. We have stopped doing investigations because they're expensive and because we don't have to. We as a trade. I still do them, but that's because I'm a dinosaur.
Now, when you do these now, you're funding it on your own.
Yeah, I will fund what I can, and at some point I will try and persuade either a network or a publisher to support the work. And sometimes they do, and most often they don't.
Right. And you think one of the reasons why that the major networks no longer fund this type of serious investigation is because now they're owned by 6 corporations and it's just so much controlled and centralized?
No, in the UK it's different. The broadcast media over here used to be incredibly heavily regulated. Now, I'm personally a fan of regulation. I think regulation is what protects people. And it used to be that networks, to continue to be issued or allowed to have licenses to broadcast, had to promise to do a certain amount of serious work, be that in investigations or in arts films or religious programming or sport or anything. They had to say, we will promise to broadcast X number of hours of serious work. And successive governments over here have removed all of those requirements from the licenses. And so it is much easier and much cheaper for the networks to broadcast America's Next Top Model or cheap stuff, which rates highly, and the advertisers like it, but doesn't fulfill what I think of as what I believe to be our constitutional, in the UK, duty. We are the fourth estate. We are there to act as the watchdog on the other 3. That's the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. We used to have that. And once television stations stopped doing it, commercial television stations, the BBC stopped doing it because they didn't have to and they were fighting for ratings. And newspapers were also fighting for ratings, although they weren't regulated, by removing the competition for serious kudos, which is the only thing you ever got for serious work on television. The newspapers said, why the hell should we bother? So no one does it. And the result is not just that the population becomes, frankly, so much less well-informed that they become stupid and docile, but that serious abuses of power do not get challenged.
Do you think there's any hope for us then?
No. No, I don't. I mean, we're having a debate in the UK, and except the UK is a very different beast to the US. We're having a debate here at the moment about the future of the BBC. Pretty much the BBC is the last hope in broadcasting terms for serious work. It gets a lot of things wrong, it does a lot of things badly, but it still occasionally does good work. In my field, if you like. The pressure is on to emasculate it, to reduce it to something along the lines of PBS, which, I think PBS is great, but it ain't the BBC. That's what's happening at the moment. And no one, although lots of actors and theatrical directors are standing up and saying, hands off the BBC, leave it, it's a great idea, it's a great institution. No one's saying to government, you need to be challenged. You need awkward, difficult, investigative journalists to challenge you. And that's what the BBC and indeed other commercial stations should be doing, in my view, and it's what we used to do. The example, on occasions I get asked to talk to students, journalism students. It's rare that they now ask me to do that, but the example I give is, again, a British example. We had 2 huge miscarriages of justice cases over here in the 70s and 80s. One was, again, some of your listeners may be familiar with this, the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4. And these were 6 and 4 Irish men who were wrongly convicted of carrying out terrorist explosions. And they rotted in jail because the evidence which had put them there was rigged and wrong. And the only reason those 10 men ever saw the light of day again was because my colleagues in two of the stations up here spent 2 or 3 years each investigating, doing the careful, forensic, quiet, investigative work, which showed that these men were innocent, and eventually they were released. No one is doing that now.
And you don't see any hope of,
No, I think you'd have to have, you'd have to have, it's like turkeys voting for Christmas. You'd have to have politicians who say, do you know what, we really want a press and a media that challenges us and exposes our misdeeds. Why would they?
You're absolutely right, but you're kind of leaving us on a sad note here at the end of this.
I ain't Mr. Chuckles.
What was that?
I'm not Mr. Chuckles here.
I know. So, well, I want to thank you for coming on. We're down to the last couple of minutes. What do you want to leave us with? How can people find you? Or
Our website, my company's website is here, and there are contact details on it. We're www.interestingfilms.co.uk. You can view some of the films we've made on there. I've got a new website coming up, which will hopefully have many more of the films and all of the books, or excerpts from the books that I've written. Not to leave it on too grim a note, there are still people doing this work. There are still people who are willing to put the hard work in, who say it is our job to dig, to investigate, and to hold power to account. Most famously, Glenn Greenwald and Edward Snowden in your neck of the woods are doing that. And others, there are people still doing this. What is sadly true is that there are very, very, very much fewer. There are fewer of us doing that.
Well, Mr. Tate, thank you so much for coming on my show. I really appreciate it. And
you're welcome.
I really respect everything you've said today so much. And you know what? I got to say, as much as it is kind of depressing, it's encouraging to me to see someone devote their life to the truth and getting the truth out there and working so hard, and to see it, at this stage of your career that you're still, just fighting with every bone in your body and speaking out. And thank you very much.
You're very welcome, and good luck with everything you do.
Thank you, sir. And I'll send you that link to I'm going to send you a copy of the scanned copy of that police report I was telling you about, and a link to your own interview that you did 30 years ago.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, sir.
Take care. Bye-bye.